The photograph in the attic. The attic had always been a place of mystery in Eleanor's childhood home. Even now, as she stood at the bottom of the narrow staircase, the old wooden ladder folded down like a stiff, tired arm, she hesitated before climbing. It had been nearly 40 years since she'd last stepped foot inside. Outside, the late October sky was pale and brittle, casting long, skeletal shadows across the leaf-littered porch. Eleanor had come back to her parents' house after the passing of her mother. Now the house stood silent and a bit too large, and the air inside carried a musty scent of time itself. She exhaled and reached for the flashlight she had set on the second step, flicking it on with a soft click. A cone of yellowish light swept across the ceiling, catching motes of dust suspended like stars. The attic hatch creaked open with reluctant groans, as if annoyed to be disturbed after so long. She climbed the ladder slowly, each step creaking beneath her weight. The attic was just as she remembered it, filled with forgotten furniture, boxes stacked high, and old suitcases with fraying leather straps. She swept the flashlight across the room, tracing the outline of a rocking horse she hadn't seen since 1969, a broken lamp, and a corner where holiday decorations had once been stored. But then her beam stopped. There, propped against the far wall, was a dusty wooden trunk. It looked like it hadn't been touched in decades, its brass latch dull by time. Eleanor moved toward it, her heart strangely heavy. She remembered it vaguely. Wasn't this where her father used to keep old papers? Letters? Maybe even photographs? She knelt down and undid the latch. It popped open with a dull snap, and the lid creaked as she lifted it. Inside were yellowed envelopes, a leather-bound notebook, and near the bottom, an old black and white photograph in a tarnished silver frame. Eleanor picked it up, brushed off the dust, and blinked. It was her parents, younger than she had ever seen them. Her father, Charles, was wearing his military uniform. He had been barely 20 then, and her mother, Marianne, clutched his arm, looking radiant and full of hope. But something else caught her eye. In the corner of the frame, there was handwriting, small, faint, almost completely faded. For the one moment that mattered most, see. Eleanor sat back on her heels, staring at the photograph as a chill passed through her. She had known her father had served, but they had never spoken much about the war, and they certainly hadn't spoken about this photo. She had never seen it before. Why had he hidden it away? The morning after George discovered the photograph, he awoke with an odd sensation fluttering in his chest, something between anticipation and fear. The house was still, save for the occasional groan of which stretching with the warming sun. He sat up in bed, rubbing his eyes, his thoughts immediately returning to the attic. He hadn't dreamed it. That photograph, the way it was tucked so carefully in the envelope, the name on the back, and more than anything, the feeling it gave him, as if the past was standing right beside him, whispering in a language he used to understand. George had spent most of his adult life as a practical man, a teacher for 30 years, then a volunteer at the local library. After Marion passed, he had taken to reading history books not just for interest, but for structure, for the comfort of beginnings, middles, and ends. But this photograph wasn't part of any tidy chapter. It was something forgotten, or maybe something that had waited patiently for him. He dressed with more care than usual that morning, wore the corduroy pants Marion always liked and the sweater with elbow patches he'd nearly donated last spring. He made coffee, poured it into a chip mug, and stood by the kitchen window, staring at the garden Marion once tended. Then he went back up to the attic. Dust motes floated through the air like gentle spirits. He stepped over old trunks and yellowing newspapers, back to the spot where he found the photograph. George sat cross-legged on the wooden floor, the envelope in his hands again. The name scrawled on the back still said, "To Henry, 1948. Always remember the music. Love, L." "Henry," George murmured. "That's my father. But who was L? And what music?" He remembered so little of his father's early life. Henry had been a quiet man, almost somber. He died when George was 22, years before George cared to ask the important questions. Marion used to tell him that men like Henry carried silent wars in their hearts, things they never spoke about but always remembered. George traced the edges of the photograph with his thumb. There was something about the woman's eyes. She seemed to be looking beyond the camera, beyond the moment, straight through to something only she could see. And then there was the setting, barely visible behind her, a river, maybe, trees heavy with summer, and in her lap, a small wooden instrument. He squinted. Was a mandolin? Suddenly, something shifted in his memory. A sound, a lullaby. He pushed himself up on the floor, joints creaking, and made his way down to the living room where a cluttered bookcase sat under the window. He rummaged through it, pulling out an old photo album labeled Henry, 1930s to 1950s. The leather cover cracked as he opened it. There, tucked between faded snapshots of camping trips and black and white Christmas mornings, was another picture. Henry, young and gangly, standing beside a woman near a river. The same trees. But this time, he was holding the mandolin. George sat back slowly. His fingers trembled slightly. This was no coincidence. The woman must be Elle. And if she'd given Henry the mandolin, maybe she'd also given him something else. A reason to play, to remember, to forget. He turned the photo over. Nothing. George rubbed his chin. There had to be more. Letters? A diary? He returned to the attic with a new sense of purpose, pulling open old boxes one by one. The attic was a museum of the forgotten. Marion's recipe cards, his daughter's childhood drawings, a Boy Scout sash with badges barely hanging on. Finally, under a stack of old military uniforms, he found a thin leather-bound journal. Inside the front cover it read, HC 1946. Henry Kavanaugh. His father. George turned the pages carefully. The entries were brief. Descriptions of places, notes about weather. But interspersed among them were references to Lena. July 13th, 1948. Lena sang to me by the river again today. I never knew how a voice could quiet the world. September 1st, Lena left today. Said her family needed her. Said this summer would be ours forever in music. George read on, his heart aching with each page. The story of Lena and Henry unfolded in fragments. Stolen afternoons, songs shared under trees, promises whispered and never spoken aloud again. It was a summer love, one that never made it past the leaves changing. He found himself wondering, did Marion ever know? Did Henry keep all of this tucked away, even as he built a life with George's mother? Or had this chapter been closed, quietly, mournfully? That evening, George sat on his porch with a photograph in his lap. The sky was streaked with pink and gold, the first cool breeze of autumn whispering through the trees. In his hand, he held a cup of tea, but his mind was far away. He thought about the weight of silence. How many stories had been lost because someone chose not to speak, or because the moment had passed and no one had asked? George closed his eyes and could almost hear it again, a soft melody from long ago, carried on a breeze, echoing from a riverbank summer, a song that had lived in the quiet corners of his family for generations. Tomorrow, he would drive into town. He'd go to the records office, the historical society. Maybe someone remembered Lena. Maybe she had a family. Maybe they had stories, too. But tonight, he simply listened. And in that silence, he heard his father's heart. The days that followed Nora's discovery in the attic settled into a rhythm both familiar and changed. The house had always been quiet, but now it was a quiet filled with thought, the sort that echoes down hallways and seeps through the floorboards. Nora found herself moving through it as though the air had thickened. Not burdensome, but meaningful. Every creak of a stair or gust through a window seemed to whisper something. She spent the next morning in the kitchen, hands deep in flour and sugar. Baking was one of her oldest habits, a comfort that had seen her through decades of uncertainty. She remembered how Charles used to hover while she baked, claiming he was just curious, though she knew he was angling for a spoonful of dough. Today, she was baking shortbread, the same recipe she'd clipped from a magazine in 1963 and never altered. As the smell began to fill the kitchen, she glanced over to the table where the photograph now sat in a small, silver frame. She cleaned it gently and propped it beside a vase of dried lavender. The boy's eyes still haunted her. After placing the cookies in the oven, Nora pulled out the address book she'd unearthed from the same box as the photograph. The pages were yellowed, the ink faded. Flipping through, she landed on a name she hadn't thought of in years, Eleanor Bishop. Ellie had been her closest friend in the early years. They'd gone to dances together, double-dated once or twice, and confided in each other during late-night phone calls. Ellie had moved away after marrying a man from Ohio, and they'd lost touch after that. Nora wasn't even sure she was alive, but the name tugged at her. She picked up the phone and dialed the area code with shaking fingers. She didn't know what she would say. When a voice answered, a young woman, Nora hesitated. "Hello, is this the home of Eleanor Bishop?" A pause. "That was my grandmother. She passed away 3 years ago." Nora's heart dropped, but she steadied herself. "I'm so sorry to hear that. She was a dear friend. My name is Nora Bennett." The woman hesitated. "Wait, Grandma used to talk about a Nora. Are you the one who wore the yellow sundress to State Fair?" Nora chuckled. "I suppose that must be me." The young woman, whose name was Claire, laughed softly. "She kept a picture of you, too. Said you were the best kind of trouble." They spoke for nearly an hour. Nora asked about Eleanor's life, and Claire asked about the old days. When they hung up, Nora sat in the kitchen in silence, heart warmed and aching. The photograph had started something. Later that afternoon, she drove to the town library, a place she hadn't visited in years. The same librarian, now older and grayer, greeted her at the counter with a soft smile. "I'm looking for something," Nora said, "but I don't know exactly what." Together, they sifted through yearbooks, town records, and old newspapers. Nora was looking for the boy. She had a first name now, Michael, and the pieces were starting to fit, though not all at once. She learned of an accident in 1954, a family name that made her flinch, a reunion notice from the 60s that listed participants she vaguely remembered. Then, tucked into an old society page from 1955, she saw a picture. It was a church picnic. The caption listed names. There he was, Michael Abbott, the boy with a half-smile. But he wasn't alone. A woman stood beside him, and something about her posture made Nora's chest tighten. She recognized herself. She sat back in her chair, the paper trembling in her hands. She had no memory of the photo being taken. But there it was, herself at 19, eyes shining, standing beside a boy she had forgotten for decades. Except now, she couldn't stop remembering. That night, the attic called to her again. She brought a flashlight this time. As she climbed the stairs and crossed the creaking boards, she felt like a woman crossing into sacred ground. She opened another box, then another. One contained her college notebooks, margins filled with tiny hearts and song lyrics. Another held letters, many unopened, some addressed in her own handwriting. Then she found a shoebox filled with cassette tapes. At first, she didn't recognize them, but one had a sticky label, for Nora, 1961. She stared at it for a long time. Downstairs, she still had an old tape player in the den. She brought the box with her, brushing off dust and memories. The tape hissed when it began. Then a voice filled the room, clear, young, and unmistakably familiar. "Hey, Nora, I don't know if you'll ever listen to this. Maybe I'm just talking into the void, but I had to try." Her hands flew to her mouth. It was Michael's voice. To be continued. 3 days after Mom's funeral, I found myself in the attic again. The smell of old cedar and mothballs still clung to the air. Light filtered in through the tiny, round window. Dust danced in its glow, and the silence was thick. I was supposed to be organizing things, deciding what to keep and what to let go. But what I really wanted was to feel close to her again. There was an old steamer trunk in the corner, one I hadn't paid much attention to during the first few visits. It was covered with an old quilt, tucked behind a pile of yellowed newspapers and board games with missing pieces. I remembered it vaguely from childhood. I pulled it out and opened the brass latches. Inside were her keepsakes, faded photographs, greeting cards, my childhood report cards and drawings, and at the very bottom, a stack of letters tied with a blue ribbon. They were love letters, from my father to my mother. My throat tightened as I sat on the attic floor, holding the first envelope. His handwriting was unmistakable, bold and careful. The date on the top read March 12, 1965. That was before they were married, before they even moved into this house. Dear Ellie, it began. I didn't mean to read them all, but I did. Every single one. He wrote about his hopes, about their dreams, a little white house with a garden, about the children they would have. He told her how her laugh made him feel like the luckiest man in the world. He signed each one the same. Forever yours, Sam. Each letter was a time capsule. Each one a window into their early love, their fears, their plans. Some were silly, like when he wrote about a terrible haircut or spilled coffee. But most were earnest, filled with a quiet kind of devotion that felt rare and precious. At the bottom of the trunk, I found a letter addressed to me. The envelope was newer than the rest. My name was written in Mom's script. My hands trembled as I opened it. My dearest Henry, if you're reading this, then I'm no longer with you and I'm so sorry. Writing this letter is one of the hardest things I've ever done. But I need to tell you something I couldn't say in words while I was still here. Your father and I weren't perfect. We fought sometimes. Life wasn't always easy. But one thing never changed. We loved you with everything we had. Watching you grow up into a kind, thoughtful, strong man has been the greatest joy of my life. I know we drifted apart for a while. And I know that my silence after Dad passed may have hurt you. I didn't know how to talk about the pain. I hope you can forgive me for that. Please remember, Henry, that your heart is big enough to hold all the love, all the memories, and still have room for new ones. Don't shut yourself away like I did. Let people in. Take the trip. Make the call. Say what you feel. I'll always be with you in every sunrise, every breeze, every quiet moment. Love, always, Mom. I sat in the attic for a long time after reading that. The sun moved slowly across the floorboards. My heart felt raw, but lighter somehow, like a window had opened. I carefully placed the letters back in the trunk, not because I wanted to forget, but because I finally understood what she wanted me to remember. That love doesn't die. It changes shape. It shifts. It waits for us in old trunks, in fading photographs, in letters yellowed with time. And sometimes it waits for us to be ready. The rain had stopped by the time I reached the edge of town. My windshield was streaked with the remnants of the storm, the wipers squeaking gently with every pass. Ahead, the road curved like a question mark, winding its way past old cornfields and the abandoned grain silo that once hummed a harvest. I hadn't driven this way in years, not since before Mom died, not since the funeral. I remember leaving in a daze, dust trailing behind my car, like I was trying to outrun everything I couldn't face. But today, I wasn't running. I was going home. The attic photograph had cracked something inside me wide open. It wasn't just the image, though the sight of my young mother holding my hand beside Dad, all of us unaware of what would unfold in the decades to come, had been jarring. It was the feeling that came with it, the ache of time, the weight of memory, the stubborn hope that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to patch together what was left. When I pulled up to the old farmhouse, it looked like time had stood still in some places and moved cruelly forward in others. The shutters were still green, though the paint had chipped and curled. The porch swing sagged, one chain rusted, and in the flower beds beneath the windows, Mom's tulips were trying valiantly to bloom. I sat there for a moment, the engine ticking, the silence stretching, and then the front door opened. Out stepped my father. He was thinner than I remembered, though he stood straight. His hair, once dark and thick, was now a pale silver. He had on that old Navy cardigan I used to steal in high school, the one that smelled like tobacco and sawdust. He didn't wave, didn't smile, just watched. I stepped out of the car and closed the door gently. My boots crunched on the gravel. "Hi, Dad," I said, like I had only been gone a week, like I had missed 20 Christmases, 2 funerals, and every opportunity to say sorry. He nodded once. "Son," the space between us was years wide, and somehow still not wide enough. I didn't know how to start. I wanted to apologize, to explain. I wanted to scream at him for the way he'd hardened after Mom died, for the things he said when I left, for never once picking up the phone. But I also wanted to grab him and hug him and pretend we'd never been strangers. I was cleaning out my attic. I finally said, "Found an old photo of us. You, me, and Mom at the county fair." He looked down, hands tucked into the pockets of his cardigan. "That was a good day," he said softly. "You were 5. You threw up on my boots after the Ferris wheel." I laughed, a wet sound. I barely remember it. I never forgot. He looked up again, and something moved in his eyes. Not quite a tear, not quite regret, but close. "Your mother always said I'd scare you off with my temper." I didn't answer. He shifted, glancing behind him. "Well," he said, clearing his throat, "you'd better come in." We didn't hug. Not then. But I followed him through the door, into the house I thought I'd never set foot in again. The kitchen smelled like cinnamon and coffee, though the pot on the stove had clearly been sitting a while. The same ceramic rooster clock ticked above the sink, and there was still a dent in the table from where I dropped my science fair project in 7th grade. Dad sat at the table, slowly, like his joints were bargaining. I sat across from him. We didn't talk much at first. I told him about the attic, about the photo, about how seeing it had stirred something in me I couldn't ignore. He nodded, silent. Then I asked quietly, "Why didn't you ever write?" He sighed. "I did. I just never sent them." "Why?" "Because I didn't know how to say I was sorry." The quiet between us was louder than any storm. I wasn't much better, I admitted. I thought, if I stayed gone long enough, maybe it wouldn't hurt as much. He looked up. Did it work? No. Something in him softened then. Just a little. He reached across the table, not far, not fast, and placed an envelope in front of me. It was yellowed and slightly bent. "I wrote this the night you left," he said. "Every year I told myself I'd give it to you. Every year I didn't." I opened it with trembling fingers. The letter inside was short, honest, raw. It didn't absolve everything, but it didn't need to. It was a door opening. When I looked up, his eyes were on mine. "I missed a lot," he said. "So did I." He nodded slowly. "Maybe we can try again. You and me, what's left of us." I reached out. This time, I didn't hesitate. "I'd like that," I said. That night, I stayed in my old room. The bed creaked the same way it used to. There was still a sticker on the dresser from when I thought I'd be a rock star. Outside the window, the wind rustled through the trees, and for the first time in decades, it didn't sound like ghosts. It sounded like home. The following morning, I woke before the sun. The house was still. Birds hadn't yet begun their songs, and the light outside was a soft gray that made the world feel paused, like it was waiting on me to decide something. I walked barefoot through the hallway, stopping in front of the room at the end. Mom's room. After she passed, Dad had left it untouched. He'd said once, in a rare vulnerable moment, "I'm afraid if I move anything, I'll forget the way she left it." Now, with hands trembling, I turned the knob. The room smelled faintly of lavender and old linen. The bed was neatly made, the crochet blanket folded at the foot, just as she always kept it. Her robe still hung on the hook behind the door, and her glasses rested atop the closed book on the nightstand. It was like stepping into a memory. I sat on the bed and looked around, my eyes settling on a vanity. There was her brush, a small silver one with a few strands of her auburn hair still caught in the bristles. A tiny dish held the wedding ring she stopped wearing after her arthritis worsened. And beneath the mirror, a stack of little folded papers. Letters. To me. Again. I picked one up and unfolded it. "Your dad made blueberry pancakes this morning. He burned them, of course, but he tried. He misses you more than he knows how to say." Another, "There's a new girl at the library who reminds me of you when you were 12, always asking questions, always hungry for stories." And another, "I heard someone whistle your favorite tune today in the grocery store." I followed the sound for 2 aisles before realizing it wasn't you. My heart still believed. I lost count of how many I read. Dozens. Hundreds. In each, her voice lived on, gentle, honest, endlessly loving. She had written my life in absence, like she was preserving what we lost, letter by letter. And somehow, those small folded pieces of paper filled in the silence between me and Dad. That afternoon, We sat on the porch again, a steady rhythm forming between us. Quiet conversation, shared chores, long silences that didn't feel so heavy anymore. You knew she was writing them. I said finally, holding one of the bedside letters in my hand. I did, Dad admitted. At first, I didn't. Then I found one by accident in the laundry room. I read it. I shouldn't have, but I did. Did she know you knew? He smiled faintly. I think so. She never said anything, but after that, she left them out more often. Sometimes on purpose, I think. Why didn't you tell me? I figured if you came back, you'd find them. If you didn't, maybe they'd stay here forever, waiting. We watched a pair of squirrels chase each other along the fence. I used to blame you, I said quietly, for everything, for her tears, for the yelling, for making me feel like I had to leave. He nodded slowly. And I blamed you for breaking her heart, for not calling, for not saying goodbye. A long pause. Turns out, he added, we were both just trying not to drown. Later that day, I went for a walk to the fields behind the barn. The same trails I used to run as a kid were still there, grown over but familiar. I passed the old tire swing, now cracked and hanging lopsided, and the treehouse platform that had long since lost its floor. I ended up at the pond. The same pond where Mom taught me to skip stones. The one where Dad once caught a catfish, so big I swore it was a whale. I sat on the bank and picked up a flat stone. I held it in my palm and remembered her instructions. Angle, flick, release. It skipped once, twice, sank. I laughed through tears. When I returned to the house, Dad was waiting in the living room with something in his lap. A photo album. I found this while you were out, he said. Thought maybe we could look through it. He opened it, and the pages came alive with images. Birthdays, Christmases, camping trips. Mom's smile, always centered in the frame. My childhood face, grinning, scowling, caught mid-laugh or mid-tear. And then, photos I'd never seen. Ones from after I left. Her, older, softer, still smiling. Him, beside her, wearier but still standing. They had lived whole years without me, but they hadn't stopped seeing me in everything. You know what she used to say about photographs? He asked. I shook my head. She said they're reminders that time may pass, but love doesn't fade. That night, I opened the box of attic letters again. I read each one slowly, savoring her words. Then I took a pen, and for the first time in decades, I wrote her back. Dear Mom, I came home. You were right, I wasn't lost, just hiding from the hurt. I found your letters. I found Dad. I think I'm starting to find myself again, too. I love you. Always. You're a boy. I folded the letter and placed it in the same box. Maybe one day, someone else would find it. Maybe not, but I had finally said the words. A week passed in a slow, healing rhythm. Each morning began with the quiet chirping of birds and the comforting scent of Dad's coffee brewing in the kitchen. We'd fallen into a new kind of normal. The barn, the fields, even the attic, they all felt different now. Softer, lighter. One afternoon, as the summer wind rolled through the trees, a dusty gray sedan pulled into the driveway. Dad squinted through the screen door. Now who on earth? The woman who stepped out looked to be in her 70s, neatly dressed, holding a worn leather handbag. She stood for a moment beside the car, looking up at the house like it held 1,000 memories. When she saw us, her hand went to her chest. Then she smiled, timidly, cautiously. I'm looking for Margaret Walters, she called out. Does she still live here? My father froze. His coffee mug hovered midair. His eyes didn't leave her face. No, he said after a beat. She passed 2 years ago. The woman nodded, eyes shining. I thought maybe. Still, I had to come. Dad pushed open the door. You better come in. Her name was Lillian Cross. They'd grown up together in the same town, childhood friends who had stayed in touch through most of their lives. They exchanged letters well into adulthood, until something happened between them, though neither Dad nor I knew the story. Lillian sat at our kitchen table now, turning the rim of her teacup with trembling fingers. I saw her obituary, she said. Too late. I was in Oregon by then. But I've carried her last letter with me for years. It was never answered. She reached into her bag and pulled out an envelope. The ink was faded, but the handwriting was unmistakably Mom's. I felt the weight of it immediately. More of Mom's voice, more of her left behind in ink and paper. May I asked. She nodded. Dear Lil, I don't know if we'll ever speak again. Maybe this is the last letter I'll write you. But if you ever find yourself back near the house, please stop in. I want you to see what forgiveness looks like, even if I'm no longer here to offer it. Lillian wiped at her eyes. We had a falling out, she said, over something small. Isn't that always the way? A hurtful word, a missed moment. We stopped writing. I always thought I had more time. Dad sat quietly. Then he said, You were her oldest friend. I loved her like a sister, Lillian whispered. They sat for a long time together, reminiscing, laughter and tears interwoven. I listened, absorbing fragments of a side of Mom I'd never known. Stories of high school mischief, secret crushes, and dreams that never came true. She used to sneak out and meet me at the train tracks, Lillian said, smiling at the memory. We'd talk for hours. Always said we were going to see the world. Of course, she met your dad and decided the world could wait. I looked at him. He smiled faintly, eyes misted. She chose us, he said, even with all the stories she wanted to live. That evening, Lillian asked if she could see Mom's room. She always talked about her window seat, she said. Said it was where she did all her best thinking. I led her there. She stepped inside gently, like entering a sacred place. She sat on the edge of the bed, fingers running across the crochet blanket, then moved to the small window seat, where the sunlight now filtered softly through the curtains. She was still writing letters, she asked. I showed her the box. Tears filled her eyes. She was always writing, she said, even when no one answered. Later, after Lillian had left, leaving behind a second letter, one she'd written to Mom but never sent, I sat in the attic again. The photograph still leaned against the wall. Me as a child, her with arms wrapped tight around my shoulders. A snapshot of unconditional love. I thought of all the letters, the memories, the forgotten friendships that were only just now being revived. And I thought of something Mom had once written in a note tucked between recipes. It's never too late to come home. And home isn't place. It's where forgiveness lives. That night, I slept deeply for the first time in years. And I dreamed not of the moment I left, but of the ones I had returned to. There was a strange stillness the morning after Lillian left, like the house itself was pausing, holding its breath in quiet reflection. Dad and I sat in the kitchen, the silence broken only by the occasional creak of the old refrigerator. I sipped my coffee and watched the light shift across the floor, feeling the echo of yesterday's visit still rippling through the air. She brought something with her. I finally said. Dad looked up. Memories, I continued, but also a kind of permission to open things again, even if they've been closed a long time. He nodded slowly. Your mother would have liked that. After breakfast, I returned to the attic with a different purpose. It wasn't just curiosity anymore, it was reverence. I opened the trunk at the far end of the room. Inside were old clothes, a pressed wedding dress yellowed with time, and a stack of journals bound with blue ribbon. I lifted one out, its pages brittle and soft. Mom's handwriting filled the lines, fluid and looping. The journal dated back to her 20s, before marriage, before me. She wrote about books, about poetry, about walks through town with Lillian, dreams of becoming a writer. Regrets she never said aloud. I wonder sometimes if people can truly know each other, she wrote, or if we only show the parts we think they'll accept. Sometimes I miss who I was before love, and yet I don't know who else I would have become. I sat with that for a long time. Wasn't that the truth for all of us? In the following days, more letters surfaced, some addressed to people long gone, some to no one in particular. But each one wove a deeper picture of the woman I had called Mom, and not just her, of me, of Dad, of the silence between us. We had all been shaped by what wasn't said. One evening, Dad brought out an old photo album I hadn't seen in years. He sat beside me in the living room, the light from the porch falling gently across the pages. "Do you remember this?" he asked, pointing to a faded picture of a summer picnic. I shook my head. "That was the year we almost left town," he said. "Your mom wanted to move to the coast. Said she needed the ocean. But you got sick that fall. She stayed for you." I traced the photo with my finger. "She stayed for both of us," I said. We started going through everything. Letters, journals, albums. It became a nightly ritual. Some nights we laughed. Other nights we said nothing, just sat shoulder to shoulder as the past breathed around us. One letter was addressed to me, unfinished, just a few lines. "If you ever read this, I hope you found peace. I hope you see now that the silence wasn't absence. It was fear and love and not knowing how to hold all of it at once. But I never stopped loving you, not even for a moment." I folded it gently and placed it in my pocket. That week, Dad drove me to the far side property, where the willow trees bend low over the pond. It was one of Mom's favorite spots. "She'd come here to think," he said. "Sometimes she'd cry, sometimes she'd hum old songs, but she always came back better." We stood in silence, the wind stirring the branches. I turned to him. "Why did you stop talking about her?" He took a long breath. "Because every time I tried, it felt like I'd lose her all over again." I nodded. I understood now. In the attic, I cleared a space. I arranged the letters, journals, photographs, her world. A kind of shrine, but not one of mourning, one of remembering, of learning. I found myself writing, too, pages and pages, about her, about Dad, about what it means to come back after so long. One night, I wrote, "I thought coming home would be about closure, but it isn't. It's about continuation, about letting the stories that were buried finally breathe." Dad surprised me the next morning. He said, "I've been thinking about that letter Lillian left behind. The one she never sent?" He nodded. "I'd like to write back, even if she doesn't need a reply. Maybe I do." He sat down at the kitchen table and began. His hand trembled slightly, but the words came steady. As he wrote, "I saw not the man I'd feared growing up, but the man he'd always tried to be, flawed, wounded, and fiercely loving in his own quiet way." Later that night, as I stood by the attic window watching the stars, I thought of all the unfinished things we carry, words unsaid, letters unsent, love unexplained. And I thought of something I would someday tell my own children if I had them. Never leave a letter unread. Never wait to say what you mean. Because time, I'd learned, wasn't just something that passed. It was something that revealed. The morning sky was soft gray, the kind that hinted at either rain or renewal. I woke up early, not out of habit, but because the house had a different kind of quiet. Not the echo of absence, but the hush of anticipation. Downstairs, Dad was already at the kitchen table, tea steeping beside him, his pen in hand. He looked up when I walked in and nodded. "I finished the letter," he said. "Do you want to take it to her?" I asked. He shook his head. "No, I'm not sending it, but I needed to write it." I understood. Some words weren't for delivery. They were for release. We spent the morning cleaning out the old garage. Dust had taken over every shelf, every forgotten box, but somewhere beneath the cobwebs were years of things that still held meaning. I found my childhood bike, rusted, one tire flat. Dad chuckled when I pulled it out. "You used to ride that down the driveway like it was the Indy 500. I laughed. I scraped my knees more times than I can count. "Still got the scar?" he asked, half smiling. "Yeah," I said, lifting my pant leg to show the faded line across my shin. "That one worried your mother for a week," he said. "She kept saying, 'What if it leaves a mark?'" We both paused. "It did," I said softly. "But not a bad one," Dad added. "Just part of the story." That evening, I returned to the attic with a new box, not to store but to sort. I decided to gather all of Mom's letters and journals into something permanent, not hidden, not tucked away in dust. A book, maybe, or just a bound volume of her life. The word she never shared, but that now shaped mine. I found one more envelope tucked into the lining of an old suitcase. It was unmarked. I opened it carefully. Inside was a photo. Me, age 6, asleep on the couch with my head on Mom's lap. She was smiling down at me, her fingers combing through my hair. On the back, in faint pencil, she'd written, "Sometimes, just being near him makes the world make sense." I pressed the photo to my chest. That was what I'd come home to find. The days passed in a gentle rhythm. Dad and I kept talking. Not every day. Sometimes we needed space, but enough, and that was the difference. He started walking in the mornings. I started writing in the afternoons. We took turns cooking dinner. Small things, but they mattered. One night, I read him something I had written. "Grief doesn't ask us to forget," I read aloud, "but to carry love forward in new ways." He nodded slowly, eyes shining. She'd be proud of that. On a Saturday afternoon, we drove into town together. We hadn't done that since I was a teenager. The town looked the same, but I didn't feel like the same boy who had once wanted only to escape it. We passed the bookstore where Mom used to take me, the bench where she'd read aloud, the church where she sang in the choir. Each place held a memory, sharp and clear now. She left pieces of herself everywhere. I said, "She gave everything she had." Dad replied. We stopped at the local printer and talked to the owner about preserving her letters. He offered to help bind them, to scan them into something permanent. "It's more than memories," I told him. "It's her voice." He nodded. Some voices deserve to be heard long after they're gone. Back home, I sat on the porch steps as twilight fell. Fireflies blinked in the tall grass. The barn door stood open, the old glove still resting where we'd left it. Lillian called the next day. She'd read Dad's letter, the copy I'd shared, and said only, that was the truest thing he's ever said. She was thinking about visiting again. This time, not just to leave something behind, but to stay a little longer. "I think," she said, "we both needed to be reminded of what still connects us." As summer edged closer, we held a small gathering by the willow trees. Just a few neighbors, some distant cousins, and a pastor who had known Mom since childhood. We didn't call it a memorial. We called it a celebration. There were stories, laughter, even a few old songs. And afterward, we hung wind chimes from the lowest branch, her favorite sound. When the breeze stirred them, it felt like her whisper brushing past us. That night, as we cleaned up, Dad stood beside me in the yard. "I never thought I'd feel peace again," he said. "Me neither," I replied. And for the first time in decades, I felt something that wasn't nostalgia or sorrow. I felt wholeness. Before bed, I returned to the attic one last time that night. I stood at the window and looked out across the yard, where the shadows softened beneath the moon. The photograph was framed now, resting beside the journals. And beneath it, a new note I had written. What we find in the attic of memory isn't dust. It's the fabric of who we are, woven from silence, stitched by time, lit by the ones who loved us into being. The dawn crept slowly through the attic window, spilling pale light over the stacks of old photos and faded letters. I stood there a moment, breathing in the stillness, no longer filled with dread, but with a quiet gratitude. This house, these memories, had taught me that time does not erase love. It transforms it. That morning, Dad and I packed the last boxes, not a storeway, but to take with us. A new beginning. The barn, the porch, the attic, all held pieces of our story. But they were no longer anchors pulling us back into old grief. They were foundations to build something new. Outside, the sky was wide and blue. We drove slowly, the windows down, the warm breeze carrying the scent of fresh grass and wildflowers. "Do you think we'll ever stop feeling the weight of loss?" I asked. Dad smiled. "Maybe not, but maybe we'll learn to carry it lightly, like the sun carries the morning." Later, as the sun dipped low, I sat on the porch with a notebook in my lap. Writing now felt like breathing, essential, healing. In the quiet, I heard the soft rustle of leaves, the distant hum of life moving forward. I realized that letting go wasn't about forgetting. It was about making space for new memories, new laughter, new love. And somewhere deep inside, a light burned steady. Not a flame of what was lost, but a glow of what still remains. Because love, real love, never truly fades. It only changes shape. The attic was empty now, but the photograph remained, framed and bright, a reminder that even in the shadows, light finds a way. And so do we,